10 minutes. That's all the warning time Britain had before hundreds of German bombers would have obliterated London and possibly ended the war right there. But on September 15, 1940, one radar station gave the Royal Air Force exactly those 10 minutes. And what happened next changed everything. This is the story of how a technology that almost nobody believed in became the single most important weapon Britain had, and why, without it, you might be speaking German right now. So let me take you back to September 1940. Britain is alone. France has fallen. The Soviet Union isn't in the war yet. America is sitting on the sidelines, and Germany, fresh off conquering most of Europe in a matter of weeks, is preparing to invade the British Isles. But there's a problem for Hitler. He can't just send boats across the English Channel while the Royal Air Force is still flying. His troops would be sitting ducks. So, the plan is simple. Destroy the RAF first. Bomb their airfields, kill their pilots, smash their planes on the ground, then invade. And for months, that's exactly what Germany has been doing. Every single day, waves of bombers escorted by fighters cross the Channel. Every single day, British cities burn. And every single day, the RAF loses more pilots they can't replace and more planes they can barely build fast enough. The Germans call it Operation Sea Lion. The British call it the Battle of Britain. And by September, Britain is losing. The math is brutal. Germany has more planes, more pilots, more of everything. And here's the thing that made it even worse. British fighters like the Spitfire and Hurricane are good planes, really good. In a fair fight, they can take on the German Messerschmitts and even the bombers. But there's a massive problem. How do you know when to fight? See, a Spitfire takes time to get up to altitude where bombers fly. If you wait until you see the enemy bombers, it's already too late. They're overhead, dropping bombs, and your fighters are still climbing. But if you take off too early, you waste fuel circling around waiting for an enemy that might not come for hours, and then, when they do come, you're on the ground refueling. The Germans knew this. They would send fake raids, small groups of planes that would turn back, just to make the British waste fuel and tire out their pilots. And it was working. RAF pilots were exhausted, flying multiple missions per day, never knowing if this was the real attack or another trick. Squadron after squadron was being worn down. Some pilots were flying until they literally fell asleep in the cockpit, and all the while the Germans kept coming. Here's what people don't understand about the Battle of Britain. It wasn't just about having good planes or brave pilots. It was about information, specifically knowing where the enemy was before they arrived. Because if you knew where they were coming from, how many there were, and what altitude they were flying at, you could position your fighters perfectly. You could be waiting for them at exactly the right height, exactly the right location, with the sun behind you. But if you didn't know, you were just guessing. And guessing meant losing. For centuries, this was impossible. You relied on spotters on the ground with binoculars and telephones. But by the time they saw enemy planes and called it in, those planes were already overhead. Too late. But in the 1930s, a group of British scientists had been working on something that sounded like science fiction. They called it radio direction finding, or RDF. We know it now as radar. And the idea was revolutionary. You send out radio waves, those waves bounce off metal objects like planes. The waves come back to you, and by measuring how long it takes for them to return, you can calculate exactly where that plane is, how high it's flying, and how fast it's moving. On paper, it was brilliant. In practice, most military leaders thought it was a waste of time. The system was experimental, unreliable, and required massive towers that were easy targets for bombing. Plus, even if it worked, you had to train operators to read the signals correctly, and you had to build a whole communication network to get that information to the fighter squadrons fast enough to matter. But one man believed in it: Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, the head of RAF Fighter Command. Dowding was not a flashy guy. He didn't give inspiring speeches. His nickname was Stuffy because he was so serious and quiet. But Dowding understood math, and the math said that without early warning, Britain would lose. So he pushed for a network of radar stations all along the British coast, especially the southern coast facing France. These stations would pick up incoming raids the moment they left the French coast, giving Fighter Command precious minutes to scramble their planes. One of these stations was at Ventnor, on the Isle of Wight, and Ventnor was crucial because of its location. It covered the central southern approach to London. If bombers came from France heading toward the capital, Ventnor would see them first. But here's where it gets interesting. The Germans knew about these radar stations. They weren't a secret. In fact, in August 1940, the Luftwaffe had specifically targeted radar stations, trying to knock them out, and they succeeded in damaging Ventnor. The station was hit hard enough that the Germans thought they had destroyed it completely. Their intelligence reports said Ventnor was offline, dead, not a threat. This was a huge mistake because British engineers working around the clock had not only repaired Ventnor, but also set up mobile backup units. The station was operational again, but the Germans didn't know it. They thought they had a blind spot in the British radar network. They thought they could send bombers through that area without being detected. They were wrong. Now let's talk about September 15th, 1940. This date is so important to British history that it's now celebrated every year as Battle of Britain Day. But the people living through it didn't know it would be special. It started like any other day in that horrible summer. Radar operators at stations all along the coast sat at their screens, watching for the telltale blips that meant incoming aircraft. Pilots sat in their ready rooms playing cards, trying not to think about the fact that they might be dead in an hour. Ground crews checked over planes, patching bullet holes from yesterday's fights. And in the operations room at RAF Fighter Command headquarters, officers stood around a giant map table, waiting for reports. The British had developed an incredibly sophisticated system by this point. Radar stations would detect incoming raids and phone the information to Fighter Command. Plotters, mostly women from the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, would place markers on the map showing where the enemy formations were. Controllers would then direct fighter squadrons to intercept, moving them around like pieces on a chessboard. It sounds simple, but it required split-second timing and perfect coordination. One mistake, one delay, and bombers would get through. Early that morning, the radar screens were quiet, but experienced operators knew this meant nothing. The Luftwaffe often waited until late morning or early afternoon when visibility was best. And sure enough, around midday, the screens started lighting up. Multiple contacts, lots of them. This was it. A major raid was forming over France. At Ventnor, operators watched their screens intensely. The blips were getting stronger, which meant the planes were getting closer. But here's the thing about radar in 1940. It wasn't like modern radar. The screens were fuzzy. The signals could be affected by weather, by interference, by all sorts of things. Reading them was as much art as science. Operators had to be trained to interpret what they were seeing, to distinguish between a large formation of bombers and a small group of fighters, to estimate altitude and speed from the return signals. And the Ventnor operators were good. Very good. They could see that this wasn't a small raid. This was massive. Dozens of aircraft, probably more than 100, forming up over the French coast. And they were heading northwest, directly toward London. The operators immediately phoned the information to Fighter Command. And this is where those 10 minutes made all the difference. Because Fighter Command now knew, with certainty, that a major raid was coming. They knew the direction, the rough numbers, and the likely target. So they gave the order. Scramble everything. Every available squadron in southern England was ordered into the air. Spitfires and Hurricanes roared down runways all across the region. Pilots, who had been sitting in ready rooms seconds before, were now climbing for altitude, heading toward the intercept points that Fighter Command was directing them to. And here's the beautiful part. Because of those 10 minutes of warning from Ventnor, the RAF fighters were in position before the German bombers crossed the English coast. They weren't scrambling to catch up. They weren't climbing desperately while bombs fell. They were waiting, at the right altitude with the sun behind them, exactly where they needed to be. When the German formation crossed the coast, they ran straight into a wall of British fighters. The RAF pilots couldn't believe their eyes. They had never seen so many German planes in one place. The bombers flew in tight formations for mutual protection, with Messerschmitt fighters weaving above them. It looked like the entire Luftwaffe was in the air. And maybe it was close to that. The Germans had committed everything to this raid. This was supposed to be the knockout blow, the attack that would finally break the RAF. But instead of finding defenseless airspace, they found themselves in the biggest air battle ever fought. Spitfires and Hurricanes tore into the bomber formations. The sky filled with tracer fire, smoke, and falling planes. Pilots on both sides later said they had never experienced anything like it. Everywhere you looked, there were planes fighting, planes burning, parachutes opening. Radio channels were chaos, everyone shouting warnings and positions and calling for help. The Germans had expected some resistance, but nothing like this. How were there so many British fighters in the air? How had they known exactly where to be? German bomber crews, already nervous about flying into Britain in daylight, started to panic. Formations broke apart. Some bombers jettisoned their loads early and turned for home. The tight discipline that made German tactics so effective fell apart under the intensity of the British attack. And it wasn't just one wave. The Germans sent a second massive raid that afternoon, and the same thing happened. Ventnor and the other radar stations detected it early. Fighter Command scrambled their squadrons, many of which had just landed and refueled from the earlier battle. And again, the RAF was waiting when the Germans arrived. By the end of September 15th, the Luftwaffe had lost dozens of aircraft. The exact numbers were disputed then and are still debated by historians now. In the immediate aftermath, the British claimed to have shot down 185 German planes. That was an overcount, common in the confusion of air combat where multiple pilots might claim the same kill. Modern historians put the actual German losses at around 60 aircraft destroyed. But here's the thing. Even 60 planes was a devastating loss. These weren't just machines. They were bombers with trained crews, fighters with experienced pilots. Replacing the planes was hard enough. Replacing the people was nearly impossible. And more importantly, the raid had failed. The Luftwaffe had thrown everything they had at London, and the RAF had stopped them. Worse, from the German perspective, the RAF seemed stronger than ever. How was this possible? They had been bombing British airfields for weeks. Intelligence reports said the RAF was on its last legs. But if that was true, where did all these fighters come from? The answer, of course, was radar. Specifically, those 10 minutes of warning from Ventnor and the other stations. Because of that early warning, Fighter Command could use its limited resources with perfect efficiency. They didn't have to waste planes and pilots on standing patrols. They didn't have to guess where to position their fighters. They knew. Every single plane that could fly was exactly where it needed to be, exactly when it needed to be there. This is what the Germans never understood during the Battle of Britain. They thought the problem was that they hadn't bombed enough airfields or killed enough pilots. But the real British advantage wasn't the number of planes or the bravery of the pilots. It was the system. The integrated air defense system built around radar. And at the heart of that system, on September 15, 1940, was Ventnor. That one station, the one the Germans thought they had destroyed, gave the 10 minutes of warning that allowed the RAF to turn the tide. Now, the impact of September 15th went far beyond just that one day's combat. Within days, Hitler made a decision that changed the course of the war. He postponed Operation Sea Lion indefinitely. The invasion of Britain was off, not cancelled officially, but pushed back and back until eventually it just faded away as a plan. Why? Because Hitler and his generals realized they didn't have air superiority. And without air superiority, sending an invasion fleet across the Channel would be suicide. The RAF had proved it could still fight. More than that, it had proved it could win. This meant Germany was stuck. They couldn't invade Britain, but Britain wasn't going to surrender either. The quick, decisive victory that Hitler had achieved everywhere else in Europe wasn't going to happen here. And this changed everything about World War II, because Britain staying in the war meant that Germany now faced a long conflict. It meant there was a base in Western Europe from which the Allies could eventually launch a counter-invasion. It meant British bombers could strike German cities and factories. It meant the Royal Navy could continue strangling German supply lines, and perhaps most importantly, it showed the world that Nazi Germany could be beaten. Up until the Battle of Britain, Germany had seemed unstoppable. Poland, crushed in weeks. France, defeated in 6 weeks. Denmark, Norway, the Low Countries, all fallen. But Britain stood. And that mattered enormously for morale and for convincing other nations that joining the fight against Germany wasn't hopeless. Some historians argue that the Battle of Britain was the most important battle of World War II. More important than Stalingrad, more important than D-Day. Because if Britain had fallen in 1940, none of those later battles would have happened the way they did, if at all. And at the center of Britain's victory was radar. After September 15th, the importance of radar was undeniable. The technology that had seemed experimental and questionable was now clearly the key to air defense. Other nations rushed to develop their own systems. Radar technology advanced rapidly throughout the war, becoming smaller, more accurate, more portable. It was used on ships to detect enemy vessels, on planes to find targets at night, in anti-aircraft batteries to aim guns. By the end of the war, radar was everywhere. But it all came back to those early stations, like Ventnor, and the operators who sat at those fuzzy screens and made sense of the signals. Those men and women whose names we mostly don't remember, who did a job that seemed boring and technical, literally saved their country. Think about how close it came. If the German bombing raid on Ventnor in August had been more thorough, if the British engineers hadn't worked miracles to get it back online, if the operators on September 15th had misread their screens or delayed reporting what they saw, those 10 minutes of warning don't happen. And if those 10 minutes don't happen, the RAF fighters are still on the ground or climbing for altitude when the German bombers arrive over London. The bombs fall on a defenseless city. The Luftwaffe achieves the decisive victory they were looking for. British morale, already strained, might have cracked. And even if Britain fought on, the math gets worse and worse. More pilots lost, more planes destroyed on the ground, more cities bombed without effective defense. Could Britain have survived? Maybe. The British are famously stubborn. But it would have been much, much harder. The margin between victory and defeat in the Battle of Britain was razor thin. And one of the razors was a radar station on the Isle of Wight that gave 10 minutes of warning. Now here's something else that makes this story fascinating. The technology itself was so new that even the people using it didn't fully understand what they had. Radar operators were inventing procedures on the fly, figuring out through trial and error what worked and what didn't. Fighter command controllers were developing tactics for how to use radar information in real time during combat. There was no manual for this, no historical precedent. They were literally inventing modern air defense as they went along. And they had to do it while under attack, while losing, while exhausted and scared. There's a tendency to look back at World War II and see it as inevitable that the Allies won. But the people living through it didn't know that. In September 1940, victory seemed very far away. Survival was the goal, just making it through one more day. The radar operators at Ventnor, on the morning of September 15th, didn't know they were about to play a crucial role in one of history's most important battles. They just knew that enemy planes were coming, and they had a job to do. Report the contacts, get the information to Fighter Command, help the fighters find the enemy. Simple tasks, really. But those simple tasks, done well under pressure, changed the world. There's also an interesting technological race that was happening behind the scenes. Germany had radar, too. They had been developing it independently around the same time as Britain, but they used it differently. German radar was primarily for aiming anti-aircraft guns and for helping their own fighters find targets. They didn't build the kind of integrated early warning network that Britain had. Why not? Partly because Germany was winning in the early war, so they didn't feel the desperate need for defensive systems. Partly because their military doctrine focused on offense, and partly because they just didn't think of it. Which shows how much warfare is about ideas and innovation, not just about who has the biggest army or the most resources. Britain was outmatched in terms of raw numbers, but they outthought the Germans when it came to air defense. They took a new technology and built an entire system around it. They trained people not just to use the equipment, but to use the information it provided. They connected radar stations to command centers, to fighter squadrons with phone lines and plotters and controllers, creating a network that could respond to threats in minutes. This was revolutionary. This was the birth of modern integrated air defense, and it happened because Britain was desperate and creative and willing to try something that had never been done before. After the war, Air Chief Marshal Dowding, the man who had pushed for the radar network, was quietly retired. He didn't get the recognition that other military leaders received. There were no parades for him, no dramatic promotions. Some historians think this was because he was difficult to work with, stuffy and inflexible. Others think it was because he didn't play political games well. But whatever the reason, Dowding faded from the spotlight pretty quickly. Yet without him, the radar network doesn't get built. Without that network, the Battle of Britain is lost. It's one of those historical ironies. The person most responsible for one of Britain's greatest victories was largely forgotten by the public. The same is true for the radar operators, the engineers who kept the stations running, the plotters in the operations rooms. These weren't glamorous jobs. They didn't involve flying Spitfires or charging enemy positions. They involved sitting at screens, making phone calls, moving markers on maps. Boring technical work, except that boring technical work won the battle. In the decades since, radar has become so commonplace that we barely think about it. Every airport uses it, ships have it, police use it to catch speeding drivers. Weather forecasting depends on it. It's invisible infrastructure, always working in the background. But in 1940 it was cutting edge, experimental, and uncertain. And the fact that it worked, that it proved itself on September 15th at Ventnor and the other stations, ensured that Britain survived. There's a memorial now on the Isle of Wight, at the site where Ventnor Radar Station once stood. The original towers are long gone, replaced by newer technology and eventually decommissioned altogether. But the memorial recognizes what happened there. How a handful of people watching blips on screens gave their country the warning it desperately needed. How 10 minutes made all the difference. If you ever visit, it's worth stopping by. Not because it's a grand or impressive sight, it's actually quite modest, but because standing there you can imagine what it must have been like. September 15th, 1940. You're a radar operator. Your eyes are tired from staring at the screen. You've been at this for weeks, and every day brings more attacks, more stress, more fear. And then you see it. Contacts, lots of them. Your heart rate jumps. You reach for the phone. You report the information, your voice steady despite the adrenaline. Somewhere miles away, a controller receives your report. Orders are given. Pilots scramble. Engines roar. And 10 minutes later, when the German bombers cross the coast expecting an easy run to London, they instead find British fighters rising to meet them. You don't see any of that from your radar station. You just see blips on a screen, but you know that what you did mattered, that your job, as technical and unglamorous as it is, just saved lives, maybe even saved your country. That's the story of how one radar station saved Britain in 10 minutes. It's a story about technology, yes, about radar and radio waves and innovation. But it's more about people who believed in a system that others doubted, people who worked desperately to repair damaged equipment and get it back online, people who learned new skills under pressure, people who did their jobs with precision when it mattered most. And it's a reminder that in war, as in life, Sometimes the most important contributions come from the least expected places, not from the front lines or the cockpits or the battleships, but from a small station on an island where a few dedicated people watched their screens and made sure their country had the one thing it needed most: time. 10 minutes of time, just enough to scramble the fighters, just enough to position them correctly, just enough to turn a potential disaster into a victory, just enough to change history. If you want to see what happened next in the air battle, click that next video now.